you want to follow along in your Bibles this morning, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 2, just the first 3 verses. Extremely familiar passage as we conclude our series on kings. We're going to look at 2 kings this morning. 2 kings in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. The lady's name is Bridget Gabriel. I don't know if you're familiar with that name or not. Up till a few months ago, I wasn't. I saw her interviewed by a guy named Ben Carson and listened to a podcast and was extremely impressed with her personal story and background as well as her credentials. And it made me better understand why she was invited to sit on a panel. On this panel, there were 4 different people with various backgrounds and expertise. And they were commenting, it's been quite some time ago, because they were commenting on recent bombing that took place in Benghazi, if you remember that. And at this particular meeting, when they were responding to people after the presentation, they had an open microphone, and a woman came to the microphone. She was obviously dressed in Muslim garb. And her comment was something to the effect that most Muslims are peaceful. And she had resented just a few radicals taking down the entire Muslim community. I don't remember exactly how she said it, but she said, they're the minority. Most of us are peaceful. Well, Bridget Gabriel immediately leaned into her microphone and said, first of all, we've been talking about the loss of American lives. We've been talking about politically what position we should take. You're the first person today who brought up the subject of religion. But since you brought it up, let me go ahead and comment on this. It's true what you say. As far as the people who investigate these sorts of things, they say that the radicals amongst the Muslims are anywhere from 15 to 25%, maybe a little bit more. But that 15 to 25%, if you take the world population of Muslims, that represents at least 180 million, up to over 300 million people who have dedicated their existence to the eradication of life as we know it in the West. And I know they're a minority. But can we do a little bit of history here? Do you realize that before World War II, that you could accurately say that most Germans were peace-loving people? But the majority of peace-loving people in Germany were irrelevant because they weren't in control and they didn't have the power. And as a result, World War II, 60 million people lost their lives. 14 million of them in concentration camps. 6 million of those in concentration camps were Jews. She said shortly after World War II, in Russia, most Russians, Soviet Union at that time, could be called peace-loving people, and accurately so. But the peace-loving majority were irrelevant because the guy in charge, a guy named Joseph Stalin, ended up killing over 20 million of his people because he was in charge and he had the power. Shortly after him, there was a guy named Chairman Mao in China. At that time, you could accurately say that most Chinese were peace-loving people. You know what? The peace-loving majority were irrelevant. You know why? Because they weren't in control. They didn't have the power. And Mao, boy, the estimates are anywhere from 20, 30 million to well over 100 million people killed in a program, killing his own people. Before World War II started, the Japanese were considered peace-loving people, at least the majority of them. But the majority of peace-loving people were irrelevant. And every time she said the word irrelevant, she just leaned into that microphone. They were irrelevant. You know why? Because they weren't in control. They didn't have the power. People in control wreaked havoc across Southeast Asia. And the millions that they murdered before the wars were done by bayonet and swords. She said, you know what? The majority of Muslims in the United States of America before 9/11 could be called peace-loving people. 2.3 million Muslims at that time. But you know what? It only took a handful. The majority were irrelevant. They still struck the towers and brought them down. By this time in her speech, everybody in the audience is applauding so much she can't go on any further. She very effectively made the point, a point that I want us to think about this morning, because sometimes we think about ourselves as, you know what, I'm a pretty good person, I got a pretty good heart. Can I just say this? That's irrelevant. I know I'm overstating the point, but it really is irrelevant. At the end of the day, the question you have to ask yourself is, what are you doing? In Matthew, the 7th chapter, here's the way Jesus put it. He says, you can tell a tree by its what? By its fruit. What actually happens? The tree may feel very good about itself, but you're going to judge the tree by its fruit. And Jesus goes straight from talking about your fruit, what you actually do in your life, to talking about who's Lord in your life. And I think the connection's important. Because at the end of the day, it's not so much how we feel, it's not so much what we think about ourselves most of the time, it's what you do. And what you do is determined by who's in control and who has the power. To say it biblically, this is the way I'd like to say it. What you end up doing in your life is directly related to who's your king. And far too many people don't have the right king. And because of that, their lives are a mess. That's why we're finishing up this short series on kings in the Bible, because it's such an important topic. And we're going to finish up the series by looking at two kings. A really bad king, because it illustrates what happens to you if you don't have the right king. And then we're going to look at the best king. King of Kings. Let's look at these verses. Matthew chapter 2. Kind of verses that we usually read around Christmas time. I hope it's very familiar to you. Here's what it says. Beginning in the 2nd chapter of Matthew, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? We saw a star when it rose, and we've come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. That's all I want to read, because that's, I think, enough information to pursue this idea of the contrast between the kind of king that you choose in your life. First of all, we have King Herod for us here. There's more than one Herod in the New Testament. In fact, you're going to read about a different Herod. This Herod dies before Jesus' ministry. He's called Herod the Great. You're going to get a different Herod at the beginning of the book of Acts, and still a different Herod at the end of the book of Acts. But this Herod is usually called in history Herod the Great. He's called Herod the Great because he was a great administrator. He was a great builder. He had a lot of building projects. In fact, he was the one who started the refurbishing of the temple and made it into something spectacular that people would come just to see this amazing building project. So, yeah, he did some amazing things as far as the politician's concerned. But he's really referred to as Herod the Great because he was such a great guy at being awful. And I can't emphasize this enough. You know the rest of the story. When the Magi outwit him, remember what he decides to do? Figuring when they started their trip and everything else, calculating it out, he figured that if he killed all the baby boys 2 years and under in that region, he would get rid of anybody who might be a challenge to the fact that he is king, right? Listen, historians, even historians who don't believe in the Bible, have no problem at all with the biblical story here. You know why? Because they know about King Herod. You know what King Herod did? Herod the Great murdered his favorite wife. Yeah, he had more than one wife. And he murdered his favorite wife. Why did he murder his favorite wife? Because he thought she was planning behind his back to take the kingdom away from him. Not only did he murder his favorite wife, he murdered 2 of her sons. He also murdered her mother because he thought she was involved in the planning behind his back. In fact, one of his other wives had a son that he thought was maybe growing up a little bit too fast. He had him murdered too. Why? Because he was afraid that somebody was going to take his kingdom away from him. This guy was awful, and he was paranoid. Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that King Herod made plans. He made plans with his military that on the day that he died, they were supposed to go out and they were supposed to kill different leaders in the community, a whole bunch of the leaders in the community. You know what he was thinking with that? He wanted the leaders in the community killed because he wanted to make sure somebody would be crying on the day that he died. He knew nobody would cry when he died. I mean, he had enough sense about him to know that he was that kind of a bad guy. Okay, that's the background. We go into a lot more detail, but I think you get the flavor of what an awful guy this was, right? Okay, here's my question. It's in the 3 verses that we read. It says in the Bible, it wasn't just Herod who was disturbed when he heard that there was born this king of the Jews. It says Herod was disturbed and all Jerusalem along with him. Why in the world was all Jerusalem disturbed at this? You know, in the first blush, you know, when you're just reading this, I've done this before. I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, these guys are Jews. Weren't they looking forward to the Messiah coming? Wouldn't this be good news to them? Why are they disturbed? And then it kind of hit me. If you lived in North Korea right now, there's a dictator there and his name's Kim. You know what? When he gets upset, I bet you that upsets you too. Do you know why? Because you don't want to mess with this guy who's already a nasty, bad guy. If he's upset, what in the world is that going to mean for the rest of us? Does that make sense? They're probably upset because they realize when you upset a king like that, things are just going to go bad. Listen, I'm going to stop right there with Herod, because Herod, I think, is a great illustration of this simple point. And the simple point is this: if you put anybody in that chair, that throne of your life, and make anybody your king, anything your king, other than Jesus, it's going to mess up your life. It will leave you high and dry. I know the Bible is very free about the fact that it talks about there are pleasures associated with sin. And a lot of times, whatever it is we put in that chair. Because sometimes, when you think of this idea of king, God, whatever's most important to you, it's not a person. Sometimes it's health. Sometimes it's making money. Sometimes it's achieving a position. That's why I think the best commentary on this in the Old Testament is found in the book of Ecclesiastes. In the book of Ecclesiastes, the wisest man who ever lived says, listen, you can pursue anything you want under the sun. And by the way, next time you read the book of Ecclesiastes, please pay attention to that phrase. He keeps using under the sun. It's very significant. And in the book of Ecclesiastes, powerful message, but it's easy to misunderstand unless you get this phrase, under the sun. What does he mean by under the sun? He's talking about as if there's nothing beyond the sun. It's code language for saying as if there is no God. As if this world is all there was. And that's what he does through the entire book of Ecclesiastes. Life under the sun, as if there is no God. What are you going to do with your life? Well, you can pursue making a lot of money. You can pursue wisdom. You can pursue wine, having a good time. He talks about all the major pursuits in life. And from personal experience, he talks about the fact that, you know what? I pursued it more than anybody else. And it's like dust in the wind. It will always leave you empty and unfulfilled. And you and I know people like that, don't we? We know people who are chasing a dream and pursuing something in life, and maybe they enjoy it a little bit, but at the end of the day, we know it's going to leave behind dry. That's why we've got to look at the alternative, and not just look at the alternative because he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, but this is the best decision that people can ever possibly make. Here's the way Jesus is introduced in those verses we just read. Did you catch it? The Magi came and they wanted to know, where is the one who was born King of the Jews? Would you think about that phrase with me for just a minute? Born King of the Jews. If a king and a queen, if they have a child, and it's a male child, and it's the first male child, and one day he would be king, when they have that child, they don't call him a king. What do they call him? They call him a prince. You always call the child a prince if it's a male child of the king. You're not born a king. You don't become king until dad dies, or until later on he hands the kingdom over to you. Do you get the uniqueness, the unusual way that this is stated? We want to know where this one who is born King of the Jews. I think one of the things the Bible is doing to us is, again, pointing to the uniqueness of Jesus. Not only is he born king, there has never been a king like him. He is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And this is just another way the Bible's trying to emphasize that all the way through Jesus' ministry. He kept saying in John chapter 5, verse 36, over in John chapter 10, verses 37 and 38, he says, if you have a hard time believing in what I'm saying and what I'm doing, then look at the signs. Look at the miracles that I perform. Why did Jesus say that? Because he did things that nobody else could do. In Mark, the 2nd chapter, while they're in Capernaum, there's some guys who want to get their friend to Jesus because he's lame and they can't get in. So they have to make a hole in the roof and they have to lower him through the roof. And this guy's lame, and Jesus looks at him and he says, son, your sins are forgiven. And Jesus knows what everybody's thinking. You remember this story? Jesus knows what everybody's thinking. Everybody's thinking, whoa, wait a minute. Only God can forgive sins. What's this guy think that he's doing here? And so Jesus, reading their thoughts, do you remember what he said next? He says, in order that you might know that I, the Son of Man, have authority to forgive sins. He turns to the guy again and he says, pick up your mat and walk. Right? In other words, Jesus is going to do something you can see with your eyes to prove something that you cannot see with your eyes. And what is it he's trying to prove? That he has authority to forgive sins. That doesn't go far enough. When he proves that he has authority to forgive sins, what does that prove? They already knew the only person who could forgive sins is God. So what Jesus is doing time and time again through his miracles is he's not just proving, wow, this is a great prophet. No. He's proving to somebody beyond this world has entered into this world. Listen, there are so many miracles that maybe it's because, I don't know if you're like me, you grew up in church and you've read these things and you're familiar with these stories. Man, go back and reread the miracles. Mark, the 4th chapter. Mark chapter 4. When Jesus calms the storm. Jesus doesn't just calm the storm. Do you remember the apostles? The apostles most of them are fishermen, right? They're experienced fishermen and they're used to storms. They think they're going to die. And so they go and they wake up Jesus and say, don't you care that we might die? And what does Jesus do? He goes out, peace. He says peace over the storm, right? Here's what, I mean, the gospel writers tell us about this, but I love the way Mark tells us about this, because he uses some words there in the Greek language when he originally wrote this. It was a raging storm, and if your translation says that he calmed the storm, that's not good enough. That's not what the Greek says. You know what it says? It was a raging storm, and he said that word, and then the sea turned into like a piece of glass. It wasn't that the storm died down. At one word, the raging storm stopped. And it's like there's no waves at all. And that's why even the apostles have been around him for a while. We're looking at each other like, who is this guy? Well, what do they mean when they said a question like that? He's more than a prophet. He's more than what? Eye has not seen, ear has not heard, neither has entered the heart of man. Who is this man? He's proving something. He's proving something not just by giving sight to the blind, giving sight to a man who was born blind. He stopped funeral processions and raised people back from the dead. He called his friend Lazarus out of the tomb. He himself brought himself back to life. Okay. I know when we review these things, I don't know about you, I just get riled up because it's like, wow. But I also know that people have problems with this. A lot of people fancy themselves as being too rational. I'm a rational person. I just can't accept what the Bible says about miracles. You know, I know I'm going to be very simplistic here, but I got to respond to that. If you fancy yourself as too rational to believe in miracles because they don't happen, you, by that same rationality, have just eliminated any new scientific discovery because it hasn't happened yet. Are you with me on that? Listen, I know it doesn't happen. And that's the point. Because what Jesus is trying to prove is something beyond this world has entered into this world. I think from the very beginning, that's one of the things the Bible's trying to emphasize when he says he's born king. He's a king like nobody else has ever seen. So what are the implications of this? If the wrong king is sitting in the throne of your life, sooner or later it's going to fall apart and it will leave you totally unfulfilled. But if you have the right king sitting in the throne of your life, what are the implications of this? Listen, can you just, I know you know this, but can you just review this in your mind with me? The Bible talks about when you make that choice, you have a hope that goes beyond this life. You have resources available to you throughout this life. But I say that too quickly, and sometimes I just say it too lightly. Can you just chew on this thought with me for a minute? When the Bible talks about the hope that we have beyond this life, does it describe that hope? You bet it does. You know, the last two chapters of the book of Revelation, we have a description of what the New Jerusalem, what heaven is going to be like forever. Do you remember some of those descriptions? Do you remember what the streets are made of? They're made of gold. Can you tell me something else about the streets? They are transparent as glass. Now wait a minute, are they made of gold or are they transparent as glass? And the answer is just shake your head, yes. Yeah, the Bible says they're transparent. The Bible also says they're gold. Do you understand what the Bible's trying to do? The Bible's trying to describe something that we don't have words for. It's trying to describe something, okay, what's the most precious thing? Well, gold. Man, let's make it a little bit better. Let's make it transparent. Why? We're trying to describe something that's too great. Do you know what the gates of the city of New Jerusalem, do you know what the gates are made out of in heaven? Pearl. Solid, each gate, huge, massive gate, bigger, by the way, than could fit in this room. Each one of these gates is cut out of a solid pearl, right? Every time I think about this, I remember somebody saying, I'd love to see the oyster, right? Anyway, pearls that big. Okay, again, what's the Bible trying to do? Trying to stretch our minds when thinking about what's going on in heaven. I'm going to come back to heaven in just a minute, but there's a principle that we need to understand if we're really going to appreciate what God's trying to communicate to us. And I think time and time again, he's trying to communicate this to us, but I'm wondering sometimes if we covered up our glasses and really don't see this. Here's the principle, and I think it's best illustrated in the Old Testament. It's a principle of when you cannot describe something, what you do is you move down the list. So if something's too wonderful, I can't put that in words, I'm going to go down to something a little less significant in this story, and I'm going to describe that. But if I can't describe that, I'm going to go down a little bit further until I finally reach something that I can put into words. Well, in Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah gets to see this theophany, this physical manifestation of God. And he just starts off, he says, in the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord, lofty and exalted, seated on his throne. And the train of his robe, you remember this? The train of his robe filled the temple. It's really significant, and especially if you're acquainted with some of the way the Hebrews, the practice that they had in describing things, this would just jump off the page at you. Because as you're reading this, it's kind of like, okay, you saw the Lord. What did he look like? Well, it's kind of like, well, I can't describe him. I can't describe his person, so let me describe his clothing. Well, I can't describe his clothing, so let me describe his shoes. Well, I can't describe his shoes. Let me just keep on going down. I can't describe the throne. Let me keep on going down. What does he finally get to? He gets to the train of the robe. Well, what's the significance of the train of a king's robe? The train of the robe, you know, that part that drags on the ground behind you as the king walks, right? The train of the robe, typically, the longer the train, the more impressive, the more significant the king would be, right? And so he keeps on moving down the list. I can't describe his person. I can't describe the clothing. I can't describe the throne. But let me get down to the train of the robe. I can describe that. You know how long that was? Well, it went from the beginning to the very back. And then it came back to the front. And then it went back to the back. And then it went to the front. Then it went to the back. Then it went from that side, that side, that side, that side. Until it went all the way to the top. It filled the entire temple. And that's just the train of the robe. When Hebrews read that, they're like, whoa! Why? Because that's the train of the robe. Imagine what the rest of his garments look like. Imagine what his presence would be. Do you get this principle? Okay, come back to the New Testament with me. When we're talking about this New Jerusalem, when we're talking about heaven, have you noticed this? The Bible really doesn't describe what life's like in heaven. It describes the streets. It describes the foundation. It talks about the gates. It even hits a little bit of the vegetation, but not life. You know why? Because it's too amazing to put into words. This is just the pavement we walk on. These are just the gates we enter through. You cannot imagine what it's going to be like forever, but let's try. Yeah. I've got a thought experiment for you. Let's say, I know this is dangerous, so warning right up front. I'm going to ask you to think about politics for a little bit. And I know it's customary, we don't talk about politics because it sets people off. I think there's a reason for that, because deep down, I think all of us realize how important it is. You get the wrong people in power, terrible things can happen. So deep down, even a lot of us who don't like to talk about it, we still have strong opinions. So go there. Just a thought experiment with me. Let's say, we're going to have an election coming up pretty soon. Let's say that the perfect candidate finally appears. And you may be thinking to yourself that the person you like is really close to perfect. Maybe you think that, maybe you don't. But even if you really like the person that you're going to vote for, almost everybody would say, yeah, but if they just changed this, you know, they really like the guy, but if he just did this, right? Okay, let's not try to change anybody. Let's make up a new character. Let's have the perfect candidate. And let's just thought experiment. Let's say that we've got this person and everything they say is like, wow. Man, I didn't know a person like that really existed. Every, foreign policy, domestic policy, everything they stand for. Not only every principle, everything they stand for. Wow, they express themselves so clearly. And anytime they stand up to give a speech, almost everybody ends up agreeing with them. When the press comes up to them and tries to give them these difficult questions, they always answer perfectly. And you're thinking to yourself, wow. Man, every time I listen to this person, it just gets better, right? And even things you haven't thought about before. Check all the boxes. This person meets all your criteria. But when he talks about things you haven't even thought about before, you think to yourself, oh, wow, I agree with that too. I hadn't even thought about that, right? So he's just a perfect candidate. So you're dreaming with me, right? Okay. So let's say before the election, he comes here to Florida, and he's in Central Florida. He's going to be out here at the fairgrounds in Cocoa, and somebody gives you some free tickets to go out and listen to this guy. And you, maybe you're not the kind of person who's ever gone to a rally like that before, but you are so impressed with this person. You're like, you know, I'm going to go. Someday I'm going to tell the grandkids, you know, I would. Maybe I'll even get to shake his hand. You think, well, probably not, but I'm going to go out there. So you go out there, and you know, just about everybody turns out, I mean, just packed. It's hard, you're hardly able to get in, but you're there, and you listen to him, and again, you were impressed before, you didn't think it could get any better, but it just got better. Every time you listen to this guy, it's like you're inspired, you're glad to be an American, and you got hope for not just the country, you got hope for the world again, right? Because, man, I think the most powerful person in the world, if he wins the election, things are just going to get better on every front. So you got these thoughts going through your mind. You're listening to this presentation out in the fairgrounds, right? After it's over, you know, thunderous applause, everybody's, yeah, and you're there doing that too. And as the guy's making his way through the crowd to leave, you know, his eyes are going out over the crowd. You see him, and his eyes lock with your eyes, right? He looks right at you, and you're like, you know, love you, man. Whatever. However you express your affirmation to somebody, he's looking at you, and you want to give that affirmation, right? And then you sense that he's walking in your direction. And you think, oh no, that can't be. I mean, there's thousands of people there, right? You're just like in a super huge mosh pit, you know, just surrounded by people squeezed together, right? And there's no way you can go over. But sure enough, he makes his way through the crowd, and he's shaking different people's hands, and he comes right up to you, and he reaches out his hand, and you're like, yeah, I'm going to tell the grandkids one day. You reach your hand out there, you're shaking hands, and then it's like the world stops. And he says, tell me your name. Tell me about your family. And it was like, there's thousands of people. How in the world can he have time to talk to me? But he's asking me these personal questions, and then he says, what's your greatest concern for the United States of America? What are your hopes and dreams? And about 5 or 10 minutes later, he has this personal conversation with you. It's like he's genuinely concerned about your attitude about America and its future. And so, you know, off the top of your head, you share with him some things you've been thinking about. And it's like he's listening to every word, and he's shaking his head. And by the time he's done, he says your name again, and he says, thank you so much for sharing with me. And then he goes on and shakes some other people, and you can't believe what just happened. I mean, a guy likely to be the most powerful person on the planet has taken time and shown personal interest in you, right? And so you're thinking to yourself, wow, this is, you know, I'm going to have, this is going to write it down in my daily journal. I'm never going to forget this day, right? Well, a few days later, passed by, and it's finally election day, and he wins with 98% of the vote, right? I mean, never happened in the United States of America. But this guy, landslide, why? Because he is just perfect in every possible way. So you're not surprised that he won, but a couple days after the election, you get certified mail. This certified mail, there are some first-class tickets to Washington, D.C., and there's a personal invitation with a note, handwritten note, from soon-to-be President of the United States. In this handwritten note, he uses your name, your wife's name, the kids' names, and he says, I got some tickets here because I want you to come to Washington, D.C. and celebrate with me. And he's made arrangements for you to be picked up in a Bentley limousine, taken to the airport, first class to Washington, D.C., 5-star hotel. Just no expenses spared in this. You're going to have a trip of a lifetime. But along with this, in that, you know, the first class tickets and all these arrangements that have been made, there's also some receipts in there because he wants you to go to a tailor shop. And so he sends you and your family to a tailor shop, and they measure you, and these guys are first-rate tailors. They make clothing for you that costs more than your car, right? You have never worn clothes like this before in your life, and it's like, wow, I actually look good. And whatever, you're wearing these clothes, and it's like, you know, again, your dreams have just gotten bigger than you ever dreamed before. So you've got these fine clothes to wear, you've got all expenses taken care of, this wonderful trip, you make it to Washington, D.C., and the day of the big celebration, Your favorite band is playing. The music's great. You're eating food you've never eaten before. It's like, I didn't know food could taste this good. Pinch me again. It's just like, wow, I just can't believe this. And all of a sudden the music stops and they play Hail to the Chief. And he walks into the room. And again, there's thousands of people there. It's this huge venue. And so you stand up with everybody else because your dreams have come true. Bright guy's going to be president of the United States. And so he comes to the microphone, he gets behind the microphone, and he thanks everybody for being there. And in the middle of his speech, he says, I've met some really, really impressive people going across the United States of America. There's one person I just want to call up to the microphone. Jay Hooper's, would you come up there? And he calls your name out. I mean, you're there and it's the event of a lifetime, but then he calls your name and asks you to come up to the stage, right? And you're like, I can't believe this. And so you make your way up to the stage, and when you get up there, he puts his arm around you, and he tells the whole audience about your family. He remembers everything you said. And he said, this guy's one of the guys who inspired me. Let me tell you what he said about the country, and let me tell you about his dreams. It's because people like this, I hope to be a good president. And you're thinking to yourself, man, it was as good as it could possibly get, and then it just got better. And it just got better. Listen, you know what the New Testament tells us heaven's going to be like? Most frequently, it pictures it as a wedding feast. And do you know why it uses a picture of a wedding feast? Because in the first century, if you wanted the most outlandish, greatest event that you could possibly imagine, it would be a wedding feast. It was the event beyond all other events. Even poor people had fantastic wedding feasts because the whole community would be involved. The only limiting factor on how great a wedding feast was the pocketbook, right? Who could afford to pay everything. If a king put on a wedding feast, then you knew it was going to be the event of a lifetime. When Jesus describes what heaven's going to be like, he says it's going to be like a king preparing a wedding feast. And you know, this wedding feast is not just a wedding feast where you're going to enjoy all the entertainment, the greatest food, have the greatest experience. He's also going to give you the clothes. Because he wants to clothe you in the best clothing you've ever been in. And then here's what it says over in Luke, the 12th chapter, a part that we usually miss. When we come to this wedding feast, you know what it says? It says that the king himself, the master of all this, is going to stop at the wedding feast when you come in, and he's going to take off his robe, and he's going to put on the apron, and he's going to be your servant at this feast. And you're thinking to yourself, what in the world is going on here? It's trying to put into words an experience you can't put into words. It's going to be the most amazing experience beyond your wildest dreams, and it will never end. That's what you get when you sign up to follow Jesus. I know this world is tough, and I know there are challenges, but it's going to be a speck on the timeline of eternity. And eternity is going to be beyond your wildest dreams. That's why everybody we know, every family member, every friend, every person we work with who hasn't made Jesus king, man, they need to. We come to the tables today. We remember what Jesus did to become king. He laid down his life. But according to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, it says when we come to the tables, you and I, as his followers, we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again. You know what's involved in that? We've made a commitment. Tell other people this is the king that you really need. This is the king that if you only knew, you would really want. Because you can't even imagine. When you pray, when you're ready to come to the tables, would you think about not just what Jesus did, but the people who need to hear about what Jesus has done for them. Bow your heads and pray. Come to the table.